Good evening, folks. Thanks very much for coming in. I hope you're all good and well. Hi, Nicole and Andy. You're probably wondering where Sarah is. Sarah's up at her mum's. She's babysitting. She should be joining us very, very shortly. So, hence the reason we've got no backdrop, because I'm on my own PC, because Sarah's PC and me do not get along. So, hi, Gillian. Thanks very much for coming in. So, tonight we are welcoming back Mr. Simon Entwistle, the man himself, who's going to talk to us about his series Tales from the Grave. Good evening, Simon. Thanks very much for joining us.
My pleasure. Nice to see you.
How have you been?
Absolutely fine, really, Scott, although not a lot of work, really, due to COVID. It's affected my business very badly. I am a professional tour guide, and I cover a lot of coach tours, which have all been cancelled. Various visits to halls, etc., and school visits, and sadly, due to COVID, it's ruined all of that. But I'm in high spirits, and there's a few billion people worse off than me, Scott, so I'm not complaining.
That's affected many people, in various different ways, and we might sit and complain about it. I mean, obviously we don't talk about it on this channel, but we might sit and mump and groan and moan about, being stuck in and stuff. But as you say, there's tons of people who are working out, and especially those who have lost loved ones to it as well, But hopefully, fingers crossed, next year will be, maybe a lot better for everybody, Hi, Gillian, Steve, Andy, Nicole. Sarah's in the chat. Evening, Sarah. It's fine. I'll do it myself. I do not mind. I'll one-leg it. Don't care. So, Simon, your series, Tales from the Grave, fascinating. You go to different locations and what have you. So, you want to tell us a wee bit about it, and then I've got a couple of locations that I want to ask you about.
Yeah, sure thing, Scott. Tales from the Grave is literally that. We tend to visit a famous grave and then tell the story. And, of course, every grave has a different story. Not all the stories are paranormal, Scott. We cover Victoria's Cross winners, we cover heroes, we cover villains, and we do, of course, cover some pretty horrible murders and ghostly stories associated with them. The locations are all in Lancashire, Cumbria, and Yorkshire. They're my real stomping ground, really. But there are some beautiful stories, and with your permission, Scott, I'll start the first one right now.
Fire away, buddy. Fire away. It's your show. Carry on.
You. We're going to turn the clock back now to the year 1795, and we're going to go to the old West Riding of Yorkshire, and a very, very beautiful building on the banks of the River Ribble called Wadder Hall. Wadder Hall was the home of the Starkey family. Now, the Starkey family were very, very wealthy textile barons. They owned a huge amount of land, and they also owned a huge factory. John Starkey had his own coach and horses, and he set off for the city of Liverpool in August of 1795. His job was to go to the warehouses, and he would buy cotton from the warehouses, and then he would bring the cotton back to his factory on the banks of the River Ribble called Primrose Mill. On his first visit to Liverpool, he met this very, very beautiful young lady called Peg O'Neill. Peg came from County Wicklow in Ireland, large Catholic family, and she was looking for work. She made her way to the warehouse, and she had the misfortune, and it really was misfortune, of meeting John Starkey. When Starkey saw her, he was very, very impressed. "Here, lass, I'll give you a job at my mill if you're looking for work." "Oh, please, sir." He took her back in his coach and took her back to Wadder Hall, and Mrs. Starkey was not at all impressed. "What you brought her back for? We don't need any more servants." "Well, I felt sorry for her," said Starkey. "You felt sorry for her, did you? You can send her back again. We don't need any more servants. Look, I run this place, not you. She's staying." So poor Peg really got off on a very, very bad foot. To make matters worse, John Starkey had two sons, James and Ian, and James and Ian fell head over heels in love with young Peg. She really was a very bonny young girl. To add to poor Peggy's woes once again, the head butler was a gentleman called John Starkey. Starkey was also very, very concerned because he had two daughters, Isabel and Jane, and Isabel and Jane wanted to marry the two Starkey sons. So therefore, things were not looking very, very good for young Peg. Things came to a head when Peg was found in a very embarrassing situation with Mr. Starkey. His wife was furious, and that night she decided to mete out her own justice. In the early hours of the morning, she and the head butler, a chap called John Vickery, made their way upstairs to the servants' quarters, and they pounced on the poor girl. They tied her wrists together, they tied her ankles together, and they carried her down the twisting staircase, down the slopes, the grassy slopes of Waterhall, down to the River Ribble, where there was a waiting rowing boat. She was placed in the rowing boat with a heavy chain attached to her ankle, and they rowed out to the centre of the River Ribble. In the centre of the River Ribble, Vickery, the head butler, threw the chain over the side of the boat, and the chain accelerated into the water. Poor Peggy realised she was going to be dragged to the bottom of the River Ribble. She shouted, "I'll hunt yous for the rest of your lives," before she made her way to the bottom of the river. Mrs. Starkey and Vickery, the head butler, then rowed to the shoreline as if nothing had happened. However, that night, Mrs. Starkey heard a soft Irish voice coming from downstairs. She went downstairs and was convinced that a stone statue of a female had somehow taken the spirit of young Peg. She told Vickery, the head butler, "I want you to get a hammer and a chisel, knock the head off the statue, and take the statue without its head down to the River Ribble and throw it into the river." Well, Vickery, the head butler, did just that. With one swing of a hammer, he took the head off the statue and then placed the statue and the head into a wooden wheelbarrow and took it down to the banks of the river and threw them both into the river. He then came back into the hall but felt he was being watched. That same night, both Mrs. Starkey and Vickery heard in their sleep a soft Irish voice coming from downstairs. That's when Mrs. Vickery, the head butler's wife, decided to leave him because he ran away with Mrs. Starkey. They made their way to the Caribbean and they got involved heavily in the slave industry. However, letters came from Wicklow Island demanding where young Peg was. And Starkey wrote back in all fairness, "I'm sorry, she left without saying a word. He had no idea his wife had actually murdered the poor girl." The two boys came down for their breakfast. "Where's Peggy?" "Oh, she's gone back to Ireland," shouted Mr. Starkey. Of course, she was at the bottom of the River Ribble. To this very, very day, poor Peg's ghost haunts the banks of the River Ribble. And in my tours, I've met 3 local people who've literally, yes, literally, come face to face with the ghost of Peg O'Neill. Way back in 1987, I met 2 14-year-old boys. Both lads were heavily involved in salmon poaching. They had a large net. They would go down to the river. They'd throw the net across the river and walk upstream catching salmon. For 2 boys of 14, they had a great business. They were earning a lot of money selling the salmon to the local fishmongers and indeed to the local hotels. On a beautiful, beautiful October evening in 1987, they made their way down to the river. They threw the net across the river. One lad was walking on the Lancashire side of the banking, the other on the Yorkshire side, catching salmon, as they had done on many occasions. The clouds above them parted, and bright, bright moonlight entered the area and illuminated the river. They then heard a strange sound, almost like a young girl singing at the top of her voice, almost like a... The sound got louder and louder, and Peggy's ghost materialised on the banks of the River Ribble. The lad on the opposite side of the river dropped the net and scarpered, leaving his poor friend on the other side of the riverbank. His friend dived into the cold, icy waters of the River Ribble and attempted to swim across. Halfway across, he felt something grab his ankle. The poor lad screamed in terror and realised it was the salmon net that was slowly entwining around him. Through sheer brute strength, he dragged the net across the river and lay exhausted on the riverbank. Panting for breath, he looked up and saw the moon. He then glanced to the right, and there he could see the figure of a young girl with a long white dress, large puffed up sleeves. But as the figure slowly turned to look at him, where there should have been a face was a hollow, dark cavity. He screamed, ran back to the town of Clitheroe, and told his story, which is well documented in the Clitheroe Advertiser and Times for October 1987. In 2009, a second sighting. This was indeed a district nurse. She was driving her little red mini metro from the village of Grindleton back to the health centre at 4:30 in the morning. She was indeed a midwife, and she'd brought a child into the world. She drove down towards the bridge over the River Ribble, not too far from where poor Peg was murdered. Mist was blowing up the river, going over the parapet. She slowed down, and there she saw a figure standing in the centre of the road. She wound her window down and shouted, "Excuse me, I would like to cross the bridge, please." There was no answer, and to her horror, she noticed that the car headlamps were shining straight through the apparition. She selected first gear, second gear, and drove at great speed towards the object, which entered the engine block, the dashboard, through her and out of the back of the vehicle. She drove home in tears and woke her parents. Her father was furious. "No, no, no, you've not seen a ghost. You've run someone over. I'll contact the police." The police were informed, and they sent a constable down to the bridge armed with a flashlight. He checked the road surface, he checked under the bridge, but could find no evidence of anyone being hurt or injured. He then had the painstaking task of contacting every single hospital in the area. There wasn't a single RTA reported for that period of time. There is a legend relating to Peg, and that legend is that every 7th year she will claim the life of some poor soul by drowning them in the River Ribble, and many, many people have died on that stretch of the river. The staff at Wadder Hall, the hall was sold to the Girl Guide Association in the 1970s, and they have a tradition, and that tradition has got to be kept going. Every New Year's Day, a cockerel is placed in a cage and left in Peg's old room, because the legend says that if she cannot take the life of a human being, she will take the life of a cockerel. And every New Year's Day, the cockerel is placed in a cage and left in her bedroom. The cockerel, in the last 80 years, has been found dead on 14 occasions without a single mark on its body after being left in that room for just 12 hours. I must say, Wadder Hall, and indeed that stretch of the River Ribble at night time, is a very, very spooky place to be. Poor Peg, her only crime in life was to be a young girl born at the wrong time of that century, who had the misfortune of going across the Irish Sea that day into the city of Liverpool and meeting John Starkey.
Unbelievable. It's a tragic story.
It is a tragic story.
Did they ever find her? I think they found her body at some point.
The body was never, ever found, Scott. But what I can tell you is the statue that had the head knocked off was thrown into the River Ribble by the head butler, Vickery. In 1926, the statue was actually found on the bed of the River Ribble and has been placed on the side of the riverbank. The head was never, ever found, but there's a local brewery called the Bowland Brewery, and they make a range of local beers, all associated with tourism. And they brought out a very good pale ale called Headless Peg.
The other one I was going to ask you about was Lizzie Dean.
Yeah, that is an incredibly tragic story. Lizzie Dean came from the city of London. In the middle of the 19th century, the north of England, particularly Lancashire, Blackburn, Durham and Cumbria, were doing extremely well when it came to textiles, and there was a lot of work for a lot of people. Peg came from the city of London. She was looking for work, and God bless her, she arrived in the village of Chipping, and she went into an inn called the Sun Inn, which was built in 1874. It's still there to this very, very day. There she knocked on the door. She met the landlord and told the landlord, "I'm looking for accommodation." And the landlord said, "A lass as bonny as you would do well working behind my bar." Forget the textile trade, lass. You can work for me. I'll give you a job as a scullery maid. And that's what he did do. So she was away from the smog and smoke of London. She'd arrived in this gorgeous West Riding village of Yorkshire. The air was clean. She had a nice job. And she was really, really happy for a girl of 19. She met another member of staff there of the name of Alicia Traynor, and they became very, very close friends. One day, a handsome young lad walked into the Sun Inn. He was called David. He took one look at young Lizzie and became besotted. Within 3 days, he'd actually proposed to young Liz. And quite surprisingly, although she hardly knew him, she accepted the proposal. They made their way across the road in front of the Sun Inn to St. Bartholomew's Church, just a short distance, some 50 yards away from the inn. There they met the Reverend, and they planned their happy, happy day. She went back to work with a skip in her step. She got away from London, lived in a gorgeous village, had a nice cottage to live in, and a handsome young husband to marry very, very soon. However, things turned very, very sour. Just 2 days before the wedding was going to take place, David got cold feet. I'm sorry, Lizzie. I don't want to marry you, lass, but I would like to marry your best friend, Alicia. You can imagine the poor girl's heart was snapped in two. And you can imagine the relationship between her and Alicia was also very, very fraught. When they made the bed, she would turn her back on Alicia. She wouldn't talk to her. She was deeply, deeply wounded. To make matters really, really worse, on the day of the wedding, poor Lizzie made her way upstairs. She opened the attic window, which overlooked the St. Bartholomew's Church. She could see the pathway which led right up towards the main door, and she watched the groom arrive by horse and trap. A short while later, she watched the bride arrive. She could hear hymns being sung inside the church from her vantage place, and there and then she decided that she was going to take her life, but in a very, very bizarre method. She climbed onto the window ledge of the attic, which overlooked the church. There she tied a noose around her neck, and she attached the noose to the end of the bedstead. She heard the sound of the wedding march. The doors opened on the pathway, and out came the wedding party, with David and Alicia arm in arm, walking down the pathway towards the inn. She chose her moment, and she jumped. The fall broke her neck immediately, and she hung there from the side of the inn, right in front of the pathway of the wedding party. They looked up in shock and horror. It ruined the day, not only for poor Peggy, but for everyone else, of course. The landlord, Norman Iverson, got a ladder and climbed up the ladder and cut her down. In her clenched fist, she had a suicide note saying, "I wish to be buried at the entrance to St. Bartholomew's Church, so that when David and Alicia go to church, they will have to go past my grave." Well, she was indeed buried at the entrance to St. Bartholomew's Church. David and Alicia, the whole village, wouldn't talk to them. They were put into Coventry. So they left and moved to nearby Preston. Many people ask me, well, how can someone who's taken their own lives be buried in consecrated ground? Well, the Rev felt terrible. Lizzie came from London. She had no relatives with her. So the villagers paid for her coffin, and they paid for her grave tablet. And she is buried right at the entrance to St. Bartholomew's Church. However, her ghost is a frequent visitor to St. Bartholomew's Church, but also to the Sun Inn. I received a telephone call in 1999 from a gentleman from Edinburgh. He was coming down to Lancashire for a holiday with his wife and 3 daughters, and they stayed at a lovely place called Lytham St. Anne's, not too far from Blackpool. They had a trip into the Ribble Valley, and they made their way to the beautiful village of Chipping. The mum and 3 daughters saw a show house from a factory called the Berry Family, and they made chairs, and they had a show house with tables and chairs that were being made, and they thought, we'll go to the show house, whilst the father thought, I fancy a pint. and he made his way into the Sun Inn. It was a Tuesday morning. He was the only one there, apart from the landlord, Stephen. He ordered a pint of bitter and made his way to the snug room. He then got his pipe and fueled the pipe up to light it. In those days, of course, you could smoke in public houses. He was enjoying his pipe when he heard a strange rustle near him. He turned and saw a young girl with ringlets in her hair that looked to be wearing a dress that looked like it had been washed thousands of times. The dress was almost like psychedelic, if you will. He tried to make vocal contact with her, but to no avail. She then turned, and to his shock, she walked straight for the table he was sitting at. He screamed, as you do. And the landlord came rushing down the stairs and said, don't worry. You've seen the ghost of Elizabeth Dean. She's been with us since the 5th of November, 1835. Her grave is a frequent place where many tourists will go, and just to show their respect. Because again, poor Peggy and indeed Lizzie, they lost their lives under very, very sad circumstances. And both of them have become local legends.
Excuse me, I watched that one the other night about Lizzie Dean, and sorry folks, 2 seconds. I watched that the other night about Lizzie Dean, and you know, as you say, she's buried right at the door of the churchyard, and I imagine it would be quite a horrendous thing to see. You know, you come out of the church and see her doing. Was there not a bit of an upkick because he didn't want her buried in the churchyard because she'd committed suicide?
There was never anyone. No one complained. Apparently, Scott. No one complained at all, really, because she lost her life under extremely sad circumstances. She was from London. She had no relatives, and the Reverend took pity on her. But she is actually buried very, very near the entrance to the church. Mm-hmm. And her grave is visited on a regular basis by people from all over the country. I do know that Channel 5, Most Haunted Live, they've all been there because it's one of the most haunted pubs in Great Britain. But you imagine it was such a terrible event to take place that even in the 21st century, it's still talked about. And it is a tragic story, Scott. It really is.
Gillian says that the pub still stands to this day.
It does. Sadly, you can't go in it right now, but I just hope and pray it doesn't close forever, because we have some beautiful pubs in the area that sadly have all gone, that survived the Great Depression. And it seems that the 21st century does not like the British pub.
You went to the other great, with the Titanic one, the grave of Wallace Hartley.
Yes, yeah.
I found that quite a moving story. I mean, we've all seen the film. Well, I think everybody's seen the film Titanic. How true it is to real life, to fact, you know, everybody knows. But I was quite taken in by that story as well.
It is a very, very beautiful story. It's not really a ghostly story, but it's an event that definitely took place. Wallace Hartley came from the town of Colne in North Lancashire, not too far from the Yorkshire border, really. At the age of 5, he could play a violin beautifully. Age of 10, he could play that violin as good as any adult. His mum and dad got rather concerned because he wasn't doing well at school, but he was doing extremely well when it came to playing this instrument. They told him, if you don't work hard, you won't get a decent job when you leave school. But music won the day. Age of 14, he joined the City of Harrogate Stringed Orchestra. Age of 20, he joined the City of Leeds Stringed Orchestra as a professional musician. He then got a job on the Lusitania, this gorgeous ocean liner. And just before his 31st birthday, he was successful in applying for a job with the White Star Line. And he went down to London. He met a chap called Mr. John Avery, was given a huge cigar, and Avery said, Mr. Hartley, your CV is perfect. We'd like to offer you a position on our latest vessel, MS Titanic. You will have your own quarters. You'll be able to use the first-class restaurant. You'll play to the most wealthiest people in Europe and America. Well, he came back home to Cone. The local newspaper took a photograph. Local lad gets top job. He was delighted. He made his way down to Southampton and joined this beautiful, beautiful vessel in April 1912. The paint was still fresh. He went to his quarters, which were first-class accommodation. Hot and cold running water in the bathroom. Clean towels every day. Clean linen every day. And for the first 3 nights, he played to the most wealthiest people in America and Europe. He must have thought, I've got the job of my dreams. Of course, Hollywood made a film about the Titanic, but Wallace wasn't really portrayed in the way he should have been, really. It has been said, never confirmed or denied, that he was actually in bed when the vessel hit the iceberg. The steward knocked on the door. Mr. Hartley, sir, Captain wants to see you. He says we're at an iceberg at Summit. He got dressed very quickly, went up to the bridge and met Captain Smith. Oh, Mr. Hartley, you're a first-class passenger. The second lifeboat's about to leave. There's a place for you there, sir. Come on, sir, let's have you. Captain, I can't. You've got women and children on board. I can't. Mr. Hartley, it's now or never. He turned round and saw a young lady with golden hair and blue eyes. She was called Wendy Slater, and Wendy came from New York. She was 21. Look, you take my place, lass. Take my place. Wendy remembered climbing to that second lifeboat, and as it came down the side of the Titanic into the waters, it was rowed away. She then saw the vessel lurch up behind the silhouette of a silvery moon, and above the screams of those poor people in the water coming face to death, she heard the sound of a violin playing quite beautifully. It was a tune she knew from her youth called Nearer to My God Than Thee. And then there was silence. 3 days later, from the city of New York, vessels were sent out to find bodies. One of them was actually called the Mackay Bennett. And the Mackay Bennett, one of the lookouts shouted, body at the port beam. They launched the lighter, rowed out, and found a body in evening dress with a frozen hand clamped round a violin. The body was brought onto the Mackay Bennett. They looked through the pockets and they saw Wallace Hartley, Cone, Lancashire. His funeral in his hometown of Cone attracted 40,000 people. 40,000 people lined the streets. There was huge applause. There's a very, very famous saying. If you're a man and you survived the Titanic disaster, you are classed as a coward. And the one thing Wallace Hartley never was a coward. And Wendy Slater owed her life to him. She never forgot that kind act of sheer generosity that gave her life. And she told her children and her grandchildren about Wallace's great gift so she could live. He is actually buried in his hometown of Cone. And on Tales from the Grave, I've got a story relating to it from the grave itself. But I must say, I was actually born in the same town of Cone, and we're quite proud to come from that part of the world. Thank you, Scott.
It's Titanic. I watched the film. I've seen the film quite a few times, and
yes,
how much real, how much is fact. I suppose we'll ever know. But I do. That was the one bit that struck me about the whole entire film when they started playing "Nearer My God to Thee." It's one of my favourite, songs.
Yes.
Whatever. And I think, obviously after you see the ship going up and sinking with people losing their lives, but I think that particular bit in the film really hit home.
Yes.
Like,
yeah.
For me, just to hear that playing in the background and thinking the women and children that were still trapped on the ship, we really, no hope,
No hope whatsoever. No.
What lifeboats there was had already gone, and they knew what was going to happen, and really, really sad. But I do remember that was the one bit in that film that struck out to me was when they started playing that one. Yeah. So,
fabulous courage, really, Scott. Fabulous courage, really, when you think of it.
I mean, it says the band played to the right to the very end.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just sheer bravery. One of the other ones I was going to now, I must apologise. I've watched it and I can't remember the occasion, but it was about the little boy in the river with his mum and a friend.
Yeah.
The youngster.
That's right, Scott. We are going to go back to the West Riding of Yorkshire once again. This is a tragic story. It's not really a ghostly story, but it is quite tragic. And we're going to turn the clock back now to the 1890s and a little village which is now in Cumbria called Dalton in Furness. Living in Dalton in Furness was a young lady of the name of Grace Isherwood. Grace was 21 years of age and she had 2 children to 2 different fathers. Now, living in a small village, all the other local girls shunned her because it was really classed as pretty horrible or not right to have children outside of marriage. In fact, it was classed as a sin, really.
Mm-hmm.
So therefore, she wasn't too popular in the village of Dalton in Furness. She heard about a job as a housekeeper in the Ribble Valley, not too far from where I'm talking now, really. She applied for the job and she got it. She had 2 sons, Edward and Thomas. She left Thomas with a family in Dalton in Furness, but took her other son, Edward. There she enjoyed working for a farmer at a place called Meanley Farm. The farmer was 84 years old. She was 21 years old. And the farmer took a real shine to her and proposed to her. She thought, hey, I can inherit the farm. I'll be quite wealthy. Yeah, I'll marry you. She knew he wouldn't be around much longer. Well, things are going fine. She was living on the farm. She was married. Her young son, Edward, was doing very well at school when a letter arrived from her sister, Isabella, saying, you've left no money with Thomas. The people looking after him don't want him anymore. They can't look after him. I'm going to have to bring him to Clitheroe. Now, of course, in those days, there's no mobile phones. There's no telephones at all. The only way you can communicate is by letter. And it took a good 3 days for a letter to arrive and to come back if you were lucky, really. So therefore, Grace had no option but to go to the railway station 3 days later to meet her sister with this young boy, Thomas. She told her sister, Isabella, I can't take him back to the farm. My husband will chuck me out. He doesn't know I've got 2 children. He knows I've got 1, but not 2. He'll chuck me out. That's when Isabella, Grace's sister, said, look, let's take him to the workhouse. We can leave him at the workhouse. Problem solved.
Mm-hmm.
They went to the Clitheroe workhouse. There they met the manager. And the manager said, right, we'll take him, providing one of you stays with him. A lad of that age has got to have a guardian with him. Can't do that, said Isabella. Can't do that, said Grace. No. We'll have to take him with us. It was quite a long walk from Clitheroe to the village of Sladeburn, where Grace lived. They made their way over the twisting pathways, over what we call Waddington Fell, and then down into what we call the Hodder Valley, where the River Hodder literally meanders through the bottom of it. It was quite a warm day. They went down to the banks of the River Hodder, and that's when young Thomas knelt down to drink from the cool waters, when Isabella and Grace pounced on him. They placed his head under the water. When the little lad's legs stopped thrashing away, they released the pressure and realised they'd done their duty. We'll have to bury him in the river, said Grace. They waded out to the centre of the river, pushed back the chippings and the stones, and placed his body in a watery grave, and then put the chippings and the stones on top of him. They then went to the Heart to Bounty Inn in the village and celebrated what they'd done. The problem had been solved. They went back to Meanley Farm and things were fine. However, 3 days later, a local shepherd called Harry Barge took his sheep down to drink from the River Hodder. When he glanced into the centre of the river and thought he saw a little hand just waving with the current of the water, he thought, what? He dived into the water, waded across the water and pushed the chippings and stones back and picked the young lad out of his watery grave. He took him to the bank and was quite shocked because he had a son the same age. He was deeply upset by what he'd seen. The little boy was then taken to the Heart to Bounty Inn. He was taken upstairs to the attic and placed on a table. and word spread like wildfire that a little boy had been found in the centre of the river. Word filtered around the whole district and straight to the ears of the manager of the workhouse. A little boy. Yeah, I had 2 women here the other day with a little lad. They wanted to get rid of him. I reckon it's the same lad. I'll go to Slaburn and identify. He made his way to the Heart to Bounty Inn, went up to the attic and saw the little boy on a table. Yes, that little lad was at my workhouse with 2 women. I can give you a description of what they look like. Within 48 hours, Grace and Isabella had been arrested. They were actually brought to the Heart to Bounty Inn, which had another role, the local courthouse. They were put in a cell, had to wait for 6 days until a judge was sent from the city of Leeds to oversee the proceedings. They were both put on trial in November of that year, 1896. The first thing the judge said is, how come this young boy was found in the centre of the river? Well, sir, said Grace, we're walking back and he just collapsed and died. Then why did you have to bury him in the centre of the river? His lungs were full of water. That's when Isabella broke down and admitted to the whole cold-blooded murder. The judge had no option but to put the black cap on and sentenced both women to death by hanging. Poor Thomas's only crime in life was to be a little boy that wasn't loved. They say to this very, very day, when it's very, very quiet, little footsteps can be heard from the attic of the old Heart to Bounty Inn in the village of Slaburn, West Yorkshire.
Thank you, Simon. Says Gillian says it was a sign of the times back then. You know, I don't know much about life back then in that area, but I'd imagine she's quite spot on with that one.
Yeah.
Children are seen sometimes as a burden, rather than something to be cherished.
Yes, yeah. I mean, she wasn't married, Scott. She wasn't married. The local girls in her local village didn't want to know her because it was classed as an indecent thing to do to become pregnant outside of wedlock. And sadly, that cost that little boy's life, really.
Mm. Well, obviously your Tales of the Grey Seas, you cover a variety of locations. One place where you went was Clitheroe Castle.
Yeah.
Which has got a bag of history, even with Pendle witches.
That's right. That's right, Scott. Yeah. Clitheroe Castle is basically a Norman keep built by the de Lacy family over 800 years ago. It stands on a rocky outcrop in the centre of the town of Clitheroe. The de Lacys weren't very, very nice people, really. They had a nasty habit of stealing young ladies that had just matured from young ladies into women from their families. They were taken to the castle and basically raped by the de Lacy family. They owned all the land and the people that lived on the land. Many a young girl who complained about this was literally thrown from the side of the Norman keep down the rocky outcrop, and many an innocent young girl lost their lives. However, the most exciting period for Clitheroe Castle has to be the English Civil War of 1642-1651, where it was garrisoned by Royalist infantry under the command of Captain Cuthbert. Cuthbert was quite a ruthless man again. He also was in charge of the whole area. His garrison consisted a lot of foreign mercenaries, and these men got very, very annoyed when their wages ran out, and they decided to start their own business, which was basically kidnapping local children. They would tell the parents, you can have your children back once you've given us some money. And many a child was murdered by the garrison. It's fair to say the garrison was hated by the people of Clitheroe and Ribble Valley. They hoped and prayed that one day a gentleman called Oliver Cromwell would arrive and liberate them. His parliamentarian forces arrived in Clitheroe on the 18th of August 1648 with a huge column and some very, very good officers. General Poyns, General Lambert, General Assheton. And indeed, Oliver Cromwell himself. They were on a mission, and that mission was to get to the city of Preston to head off the Duke of Hamilton's forces that were coming down from Scotland to reinforce the king's southern armies. He was on a mission, and he had to get there very, very quickly. Of course, he had to bypass Clitheroe, and he gave General Ashton the honour of taking the town of Clitheroe. They had 3 infantry attacks on the castle that were all repulsed, and so General Ashton said, "Bring up Humpty Dumpty." What was Humpty Dumpty? It was a huge breaching cannon. It took an hour to load the thing and about 1 second to fire it. It was placed on what we now call the local cricket ground and fired 3 salvos over 3 hours, which hit the lower wall, the middle wall, and straight for the side of the Norman keep. The white flag was raised and the garrison surrendered. A crude POW camp was built within the grounds of the Norman keep, and in the early hours of the morning, 3 royalist officers escaped: Lieutenants Casewell, Lieutenant Aitken, and Captain Rockcliffe. They escaped into the town of Clitheroe, but their uniforms quickly gave them away. All 3 men were brought back for execution by beheading. Each man had his hands tied behind his back, had to kneel down, and if they were very, very fortunate, have their heads severed from their spinal cords with one swish of the axe. In the case of Lieutenant Casewell, it took 3 attempts to do this swiftly and cleanly. Before each man lost his life, he shouted, "God save the King!" They were Lord King Charles I, even in their last second of life. The very, very first people to help with this tour were from Lancashire Constabulary, 3 now retired police officers. They mentioned on a bitterly cold April morning in 1982, they took their Panda car up to the Norman Keep for a smoke break. While they're enjoying their cigarettes, they kept the engine running to keep them warm, and above the sound of the engine, they all heard the words, "God save the King." That's strange. 2:30 in the morning. Who in the right mind to be up there? They got their torches. They went up the twisting staircase and into the Norman Keep, shining their torches on the wall, when one officer suddenly screamed. The other 2 turned round to see a royalist soldier walk straight for the limestone wall and right for their colleague. Now, these men had seen some very, very unpleasant sights as police officers, but not one of them had seen anything as paranormal as this. They rushed down the steps at great speed into their police vehicle, reversed at great speed, hitting a horse trough in the grounds of the castle, causing extensive damage to the vehicle. They drove back to the police station where their colleagues laughed at them. They found their story hilarious. However, one man did not laugh. He was the duty sergeant. "Look, lads, I've been a bobby in Clitheroe for some 25 years, and I too have seen the ghosts of Clitheroe Castle. Some 15 years ago, the town was invaded by another army called the Most Haunted Live TV Show. We started Vet Fielding and Derek Acora, and they spent 5 nights in Clitheroe, and one of those broadcasts came live from Clitheroe Castle. And as Derek Acora made his way up the twisting stairs and into the Norman Keep, he was heard to say the words, I can feel it moving like, this and that, down this like, Aitken, Casewell, Rockcliffe. Well, he suddenly got the names right, that's for sure. These men lost their lives under very, very, very sad circumstances. I must say I've done many tours up there, and it's a story that does capture the imagination of the British public.
There's a tie to the Pendle Witches as well, is that correct?
The Norman Keep was used in 1612 for 1 night and 1 night only, where the cells beneath the Norman Keep were used to house Elizabeth Southern, Anne Whittle, Elizabeth Devise, and indeed Anne Redfern. They then made the journey from there to the city of Lancaster the following day. Pendle Hill can be seen very, very clearly from Clitheroe Castle. There is a legend, and it's got to be a legend, about the devil sitting on top of Pendle Hill and picking up a huge boulder and chucking it, and it hit the Norman Keep. But I think that the story relating to Humpty Dumpty and the breaching cannon are a lot more authentic than that one, Scott.
imagine there's tons of history around the place, and there's many stories. Have you ever came across any stories that are just totally, absurd? As in people coming up and trying to tell, you're a great storyteller. You're very engrossing. That's why we love you being on. Have you ever had anybody come up and try and tell you a kind of story about a location or about Clitheroe Castle or whatever?
You can always tell, Scott, when someone's pulling your leg. I mean, as a tour guide, when I do some of my tours, I will wear a top hat. I will wear Victorian clothing. It brings out the atmosphere of the tour, if you will, as indeed ghost walkers all over Great Britain do. I am looked on as a bit of an eccentric by some people. And you can always tell when someone's, shall I say, taking the mickey out of you. But also when someone's being very, very honest and very, very truthful. And by far one of those lovely stories, which is indeed a Christmas ghost story, came from a good friend of mine called Billy Lakin. And Billy came to my house some years ago. He brought a photograph, and that photograph had 57 young men on it. On the back of the photograph was everyone's name and the words, Clitheroe Territorial Army. The photograph was taken. They were all sent to the Maginot Line in France, where they joined what's called the BEF, the British Expeditionary Force. He walked up and down the Maginot Line. He met French soldiers who said, the Germans will never, ever attack the Maginot Line. It's impossible to get through. For 10 months, that's what they did. They walked up and down the Maginot Line. Bill came across German troops. He would wave at them. They waved back. They even exchanged British cigarettes for German cigarettes, British bully beef for German stew. It was called the Phony War. No one wanted to start it. However, this did change on the 10th of May 1940, when the Germans launched what we call Blitzkrieg. And the French were quite right. The Germans did not bother attacking the Maginot Line because they knew they could not get through it. But they knew they could get round the back of it. And that's exactly what they did do. Bill was in the Maginot Line with his mates when his officer said, right, boys, leave all your equipment. We go into a place called Dunkirk. They didn't so much march to Dunkirk from the Maginot Line. They ran. The Germans were hot on their tail. For 4 days and 4 nights, Bill ran and ran and ran. He got to the sand dunes of Dunkirk absolutely starving. When he got there, the whole of Dunkirk was on fire. Huge pools of smoke coming across the beach, etc. He was so tired when he got to the sand dunes, he looked around. All he could see was around 300,000 British troops all waiting to be evacuated. He took his tin helmet off and used it as a shovel to make a slit trench. He climbed into the slit trench and fell asleep. He was shaken awake some 6 hours later and told by a colleague that whilst he'd been sleeping, the German Luftwaffe, the Air Force, had strafed the beaches 7 times. His officer then intervened. Right, lads, it's our turn to be evacuated. We're going to go down to the water's edge. Apparently over in Dover, the Royal Navy have organised Operation Dynamo. They're going to take us all off the beach this afternoon. Bill and his mates made their way down to the water's edge. The water was lapping around their necks. They held their rifles above the water when a German aircraft came down the beach and opened fire. Bill lost his helmet. He lost his webbing, his ammunition pack. He lost his rifle and he dived under the water. When he came to the surface, the water was crimson red with the blood of his mates. He then felt a hand grab his battle dress tunic. He was pulled into a small rowing boat by a Royal Naval rating and then rowed out to a large Royal Naval warship where he scrambled up the scrambling nets on board. And there he was given the finest meal he's ever had. A corned beef sandwich, a mug of tea, and a delicious woodbine cigarette. The first food he'd eaten in 8 days. He said he could have kissed the sailor. He got to Dover. When he got to Dover, he couldn't find any of his mates, none of his original mates at all. An officer then said, look, we know you've come from. You don't need a ticket. Just go back to your battalion headquarters. In his case, St. Mary's Parish Church office in Clitheroe. It was the old TA Hall. He remembered getting a train from Dover to London, London to Preston, and then Preston to Clitheroe. As the train came through the little village of Whalley, it stopped. He looked out of the window and saw a game of cricket and saw people wearing white cricket flannels playing cricket. He thought, that's heaven. compared to where I've just come from. The train got into the town of Clitheroe. The sun was just going down, and he kissed the railway platform. He was so delighted to get back home again. He could have gone straight home to see his mum and dad, but he didn't. His orders were to get back to the parish church office at all costs, and that's what he did do. He limped from the railway carriage towards the centre, which was in the centre of Clitheroe, and his feet were red raw from the march from Dunkirk. It was very, very painful. He opened the door, and out of the 57 young men on the photograph that had been taken in September 1939, only 19 had got back. The rest had been killed or indeed captured. He was told there and then that they were going to make up the numbers to platoon strength once again. In those days, if you were 19 years old or 18, you were conscripted. If you were 17, you could join up, but you had to have your mum and dad's consent. Now, Bill was 19. He had a young friend who was 17. And this young boy said, "Oh, Bill, go and see me mum and dad. Get him sign this consent form. I want to fight for my country." Bill saw this young boy's parents and they said, "Sorry, he's only 17. The war could be over next year anyway. Oh, please, mum, please, dad, I want to fight for my country." They gave in on one condition, that condition being that Bill would look after him like a brother. And he swore he would do. They signed the consent forms and the young lad joined the newly formed platoon. He did his training, and then they were sent to the beautiful Greek island of Crete to make up the garrison, along with the Australian and New Zealand armed forces. On the 21st of May 1941, the Germans launched a highly disciplined airborne invasion of the island of Crete. Their mission was to capture it so the Luftwaffe could bomb the British ports in North Africa. That's why it was so desperate to try and defend it. The Brits, the Australians, the New Zealanders put up one hell of a fight, but they had no air cover, and the Germans took the island. In the fighting, sadly, the Clitheroe platoon lost 11 men killed, one of them being the 17-year-old young boy. Bill was heartbroken at the death of this young lad, and from his POW camp in Poland, he would write back for the Red Cross, this young boy's parents, just saying, "Please, please forgive me." They wrote back through the Red Cross saying, "Bill, we do not hold you personally responsible for the death of our son." But Bill was deeply upset and blamed himself entirely. He was repatriated in 1945 and came home again. He was never, ever the same man. Wouldn't laugh, wouldn't smile. This young boy's death haunted him every day. However, things were going to change on the 24th of December, 1968, Christmas Eve, when he went to the St. Mary's Parish Church Centre, which had been the old Territorial Army Hall, to watch the Clitheroe Amateur Operatic Society's Christmas play. He was the very, very last person to leave the building. Stood outside, lit a cigarette, and looked at the wall where the photograph had been taken in September 1939. He took a deep sigh. He extinguished the cigarette. He then walked round the side of the building, down a little ginnel, a snickleway, an alleyway that would take him down into the town centre. As he turned, he heard a whisper, "Hey, Bill! Hey, Bill! Hey, Billy!" He turned round and saw the ghost of the young lad standing just 2 feet away in British Army uniform. The first thing Bill noted, the young lad had not aged a day. He looked exactly as he had done on Crete in 1941. The boy raised his arm. "Bill, don't worry about me, Bill. I'm fine. Don't worry, Bill. I'm fine." With that, Billy's knees gave way. He knelt on the cobblestones in the alleyway, and in his own words, he bellowed like a wounded animal. The tears streamed down his cheeks. He almost yelped in pain. As he looked up, the boy smiled, waved, and disappeared. Bill slowly got to his feet, in a state of trauma, in a state of shock. He'd seen something very, very, very paranormal. He walked home that Christmas Eve past the happy Christmas revellers. The last thing he felt was celebrating anything. He was deeply, deeply upset and deeply traumatised what he'd just witnessed. He got into bed and, quite surprisingly, fell into a very, very deep sleep. The best sleep he'd had in many years. The following day, Christmas Day, 1968, he was woken by the bells of St. Mary's, the bells of St. James, the bells of St. Paul's. He got out of bed feeling a lot better than he had done in many years. He made his way to the bathroom. He opened the bathroom door and walked in and caught his reflection in the shaving mirror. He looked again and again and saw a change in his facial appearance. He noted, for the first time since 1941, he was actually smiling, and he felt he'd been truly forgiven for the death of this young boy all those years ago. As Bill left my house that day, his words were, "Simon, I did not believe in ghosts until I saw one with my own eyes." Billy died a good 20 years ago. Because I knew him, I felt obliged to go to his funeral. And as I sat in the pews at St. Paul's Church, the Reverend talked about his life. I then went to the interment and stood by the grave. There were two very elderly gentlemen. I had a conversation with both of them, and they said, "Oh yes, we all got captured on Crete together." I mentioned the young lad. "Oh yes. Bill was looking after him. The German paratroopers were getting very close to our positions, and Bill told him to hide behind the tailgate of the ammunition truck, as it had a metal tailgate that would give him protection. As the lad left his slit trench to run towards the tailgate, he was caught by a German sniper and killed on the spot." Billy told me that his death really wounded him, but seeing him in the next life, at least he knew he was okay. And Bill's words were that day, as I mentioned before, "I did not believe in ghosts till I saw one with my own eyes." Of course, every 11th of November, we buy poppies. And when I buy mine, I always think of those two lads whose only crime in life was to be born at the wrong time of the last century.
It's a sad but nice story, if that makes sense, because obviously this is hung over this guy Bill for many years, and then for his friend to appear to him and say basically, "I'm okay," it was time to move on, and it's lifted a huge weight off his shoulders. As you can see, Sarah's finally joined us.
Hello, Sarah. Nice to see you.
I've got a question. Sorry, Dark Fan, I missed your question. I've got a question here, Simon, from Dark Phantom. I'm surmising it's about Clitheroe Castle. He was asking, I'll just find it again. I think that's the right one there. Come up. Would you say that place is spirit or the stone tape theory, as in residual energy?
Right, Scott. Well, firstly, I'm not really an expert in the paranormal. I'm a collector of ghost stories, but I do work with paranormal companies like Haunted Happenings, Spooktacular, Dusk Till Dawn, etc. And we do go to Clitheroe Castle, and they bring their mediums with them. These are people that see things that you and I can't. I'm not a medium. I'm not a clairvoyant. I'm certainly not a psychic. But one of the Haunted Happening girls, she's very good. She did pick up on Prince Rupert, and Prince Rupert had indeed been there in 1643 before the Battle of Marston Moor, and had actually written his battle plans there. Really, she picked up on that. There's also a smashing guy called Kevin Bruff. Kevin works for Spooktacular, and he picked up characters from there which he wouldn't have known. And you can always tell when a psychic is trying to pull the wool over your eyes. But when they come up with intricate bits of history which not many people would know about, you realise that they have got a great gift. So the stone tape theory, quite possible. I really don't know. I do know that City of York have some guaranteed ones.
Gillian says you chilled after that last story, and you're an excellent storyteller. So there you go. Well, I do agree 100%, Simon. Yeah, I could sit, as I said the last time you were in, I could sit and listen to you for hours, and I've watched your YouTube, series as well, and it draws you in. One of the places I found fascinating on your series was Townley
Hall, yeah.
Townley Hall. I found that fascinating. some place.
Yeah, very, very much so. And, Scott, there is a fantastic connection with Scotland and Townley Hall. Very, very, again, quite a beautiful but tragic story. If we turn the clock back to 1745 and the Jacobite Rebellion, of course, the whole idea of the Jacobite Rebellion was to put a Catholic, a Stuart, on the throne of England and restore Catholicism to this country. Now, in the north of England, particularly where I live, there's a huge Catholic gathering to this very, very day. All the local landowners were Catholics, and so were the Townley family. And when the Townley family heard that Bonnie Prince Charlie had landed on Ericsay and was going to come down to London with this huge army, many Lancashire men joined them. A lot of because they were ardent Catholics. Now, Colonel Francis Townley, because he was a Catholic, he was not allowed to have a commission in the British Army, but he went to France, and there, of course, he was welcomed and rose up for the ranks to a full colonel in the French army. He retired, came back to Townley Hall, Burnley, and heard about the Young Pretender. And he thought, I'm going to join this man. I, too, would like to see a Catholic on the throne of England. He formed a regiment, a very famous regiment called the Manchesters. They were all ardent Catholics. And when the prince came down through Carlisle, through Shap, through Kendal, into Lancaster, he was met by this English regiment of ardent Catholics. And of course, they were welcomed. They set off down south. They got to the town of Derby. In the city of London, everyone's panicking. People are taking their money out of banks. Of this huge Scottish army about to invade. And on the other side of the channel, of course, the French army are ready. They just want the word. And they will join the Jacobites to take the whole of England over. And we could have forgotten Brexit, that's for sure, Scott, had this actually happened. However, in Derby, there's a huge argument taking place between the prince and his clansmen, and indeed his senior officers. And they're concerned about what lays ahead. It could be communication problems from Scotland. It could be ammunition flows from Scotland, but they were worried. And they thought, no, we'd better go back. On the journey back, the English redcoats got the upper hand under the command of the Duke of Cumberland and General Wade. And they forced them right up to Kendal, over Shap Fell, through Penrith, and up to the city of Carlisle. That's when the prince said to Colonel Francis Townley, can you hold Carlisle whilst I make my escape with your Manchester regiment? For 2 days, that's exactly what they did do, but the redcoats outnumbered them 7-1. The colonel was captured with his senior officers, and the colonel said, I wish to be treated as a prisoner of war. I'm a serving French officer, a colonel. No, colonel, you are an insult to your country. You are a traitor, shouted the Duke of Cumberland. He was taken down to Newgate, put on trial with his officers, and these poor men were hung, drawn, and quartered, a very cruel and barbaric death. His head was whipped off, a pike placed through it, and the colonel's head was placed at a place called Newgate. His wife, Mary, made the long journey from Burnley, Townley Hall, Burnley, down to the city of London to bring her husband's head back. It was placed in a wickerwork basket with a napkin over it, and every Christmas was brought out and toasted by the family. In 1901, the last of the Townleys passed away, and the head was placed inside the chapel at Townley Hall behind an oak panel. To this very day, Burnley Borough Council are responsible for the actual upkeep of the hall. They've inherited it. And was the work chapel, and he unscrewed one of the oak panels and found the colonel's head with a large hole through it and some matted hair in the skull. The skull was then taken away from Townley Hall and placed at St. Peter's Church in Burnley. That's when strange things started to happen. Now, Townley Hall is not only a beautiful, beautiful building, it's also an art gallery. And there are some very, very priceless artifacts in there. As a result, they have burglar alarms. And throughout the whole of the 1980s, the alarms kept going off at around 3 in the morning. Burnley police would send 3 patrol cars crammed full of officers. When they got there, they same old story. Building lights turned off, but the burglar alarms were on. It went down from 3 patrol cars to 2, then from 2 to 1, from 4 officers to 2 officers, from 2 to 1 officer, because they knew they'd never find anything there. However, when I started my tours, I got a telephone call from a retired sergeant who told me a very, very spine-tingling. He told me just what I've told you about how they used to go in force, and when they arrived, there was no one there at all, really. One night, it was a November night, 1989, thunder and lightning outside, and he remembered the lightning flashes illuminating the ground quite clearly in front of him. He parked his car outside. He had a bunch of keys with him. He opened the main door, walked into the main reception area, and up to what's called the long gallery, where they had one problem with a burglar alarm, which had to be reset. He'd done it many, many times, but this night he felt a little bit. He was by himself. He made his way up the twisting staircase, up to the long gallery, and walked down the long gallery towards the burglar alarm, where he had a key which he put inside it to open the case to then retime it. As he opened the case, to his horror, he heard footsteps right behind him. He swallowed, he turned round, and there he saw the ghost of Colonel Francis Townley with his head under his arm. The sergeant shrieked in terror, glanced to the side, ran down the long gallery, down the twist, and into his vehicle. His story did shock quite a few people back at the police station, but it got into the local newspaper, the Lancashire Evening Telegraph, and that's when people put 2 and 2 together. It seems that the colonel had taken from Townley Hall into St. Peter's, that he was actually looking for his head. We should know, but it's a very, very touching story. And had Bonnie Prince Charlie and the jacket to London, I'm sure, Scott, we could forget Brexit, because the country would have been restored to Catholicism.
It wouldn't be happening. Is Townley Hall where the priest holes are?
Yeah. As I said before, Scott, in this part of the world, it's Catholic, predominantly Catholic. In 1536, King Henry VIII outlawed the Roman Catholic faith, and all these beautiful halls in Lancashire and West Riding of Yorkshire, there were Catholic families, and they refused to accept the Protestant way of life. And as a result, a lot of them would harbour Catholic priests for illegal Catholic masses. And they would actually install these fantastic priest holes. One of them was designed by a gentleman called Nicholas Owen. Who was Nicholas Owen? Probably the finest priest hole designer this country's ever had. Nicholas Owen was using slides, springs, brackets before they'd even been invented. Some of his work is so good, it hasn't been discovered. And you can pick up the national newspapers and read about our cleaning ladies from Land's End to John O'Groats who've accidentally touched something in these historic halls, and a roof is lowered or a door's come from nowhere. His work was ahead of its time. Now, King Henry VIII wanted this man captured. He really did. He looked at him as a real threat, because when his army, when his troops would invade these houses, they couldn't find any priests. They knew they were there, but they couldn't find them because they were so brilliantly designed, these priest holes. He was chased all over Great Britain. He was captured at a place called Hinlip Hall in 1606 in Somerset. He was arrested and sent to the Tower of London. In the Tower of London, he was told, if you just renounce your faith and become a Protestant, you can go home. End of story. He wouldn't. He was an ardent Catholic to the very, very end. If you've been to the Tower of London, Scott, I don't know if you have done, it's well worth a visit. You'll go to an area called the Bloody Tower, where these poor, misfortunate people, all words can comprehend, you'll find graffiti scratched on the wall. They put perspex of the graffiti, got Anne Boleyn's words there, Lady Jane Penn, Sir Walter Raleigh. Beneath Sir Walter Raleigh, you've got our friend Nicholas Owen's name, and he's scratched into the side of the alabaster, this day I shall be with my father. The poor lad was also hung, drawn and quartered. His only crime in life was to be a member of the Roman Catholic faith. A very, very cruel ending.
I've been to Tower of London, a few times, like 3 or 4 times. I've been because I'm a big Tudors fan. Just a quick question before I carry on with what I was going to say. Gillian was saying there's a bear in Townley Hall.
Yeah, true. Yeah. Townley is a museum, of course, but so the bear is a huge polar bear. Nowadays, of course, there's no way you get permission to shoot a polar bear, protected species, but this was shot many years ago, and it is indeed an attraction. I've actually done tours there at night time, would I believe, spooky tours with tourists, and when you come across the bear, it's quite a shock, really, to the system. It does give you a bit of a fright because you don't expect to see this huge towering bear. It's over 6 foot tall.
As I say, with Tower of London, I've been with 3 or 4 times because we said it. I are both big Tudors fans. I think he was one of the greatest periods in British history. Henry VIII. I think he's probably the most famous monarch this country's ever seen, except Mary Queen of Scots. Sarah's just reminded me.
Yeah.
It's a fascinating place, Tower of London. Anybody to go, you've got the lines and that as soon as before you walk in, and it's one of the things I was quite fascinated with was the suits of armour, Henry's suits of armour.
Yeah.
I think it's 3 or 4 of them, and you can see how he changed over the years in size.
Yes, yeah.
It's pretty massive. But I've seen the graffiti scribbled into the walls, and it's quite surreal standing there, reading it and looking at it, knowing that it's maybe 500-600 years old, whatever.
I love Anne Boleyn's handwriting, so beautiful, gorgeous italics. She must use like a nail file or some form of file, but beautifully done, absolutely beautifully done, really. And it's priceless graffiti, isn't it? Absolutely priceless.
But it is quite priceless, and just to think that it was actually written hundreds of years ago. Well, the other thing I was surprised with was, you probably know this, I'll call it the big disc, a kind of big glass disc, where it says the execution spot was. Yeah. But we were actually told that that's in the wrong location. It was actually the correct spot is in front of the constable's house. There's a bit of green, a bit of lawn, and that's where it actually was. So they've kind of stuck it in the wrong place. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. I know the tower was used mainly for royals and people of good standing to be executed. Everybody else was taken, like say Tower Hill, Tyburn, places where that and dealt with. As you say, hung, drawn and quartered was. I think that was for high treason. Just said ordinary treason get beheaded, but for high treason, you get the full Monty basically, and really, not the perfect way to go, Jill. And see, when I went to Tower of London, it was packed, so I left. It's quite a busy place, and I was one of the times I went. It was a heat wave in London, and it was absolutely scorching. And I ended up walking right, as you know, you can walk along the Thames to Tower Bridge. Yes, It was an absolutely beautiful day. That's the last thing I was going to ask you about, actually, the Tudor ties to Lancaster. What's the Tudor? Is there any Tudor ties to Lancaster?
Yes. Basically, if we turn the clock back into the 1450s, the very, very first civil war was a quarrel with the royal family, really. The House of York and the House of Lancaster. And as we all know, the House of Lancaster has a red rose. Yorkshire, House of York has a white rose. And after 30 years of terrible bloodshed, the House of Lancaster won the War of the Roses. Yorkshire have never, ever accepted this, really. And to this very, very day, the war still continues, but on the fields, particularly in a game of cricket, where we call it a Roses match. Shall we say, if Accrington Stanley Football Club take on Bradford City, it is a Roses match. And they are fought very, very closely and very, very determined to lose. No one wants to lose those games. No one at all, really. But there are some beautiful stories relating to it. And the one story which caught my attention was the story of the Clifford family. And they lived in Skipton. But for some strange reason, it could have been political. They fought under the Red Rose of Lancaster. And John Clifford, he was horrified when he saw his own father lose his tower. And he was determined to get his revenge by killing the... And lo and behold, some 30 years later, towards the end of the War of the Roses, he saw one of his men actually kill the Duke of York. And he thought, marvellous, marvellous. I'm going to go over, whip his head off, and place his head on top of the of York Castle with a paper crown on top of it. Well, he did. He walked across and saw the body. He took the head off. And as he was leaving the battlefield, 3 people nearby. One was a young lad, 40. On one side was a tutor, the other's a priest. And Clifford galloped across and said, "Who is this young man?" "Sire, he is Edmund, the Duke of Rutland." "Answer." "Right, your father took mine, I shall take thine." "Sire, he's only 14, sire. He's a boy, sire." The priest and the chief protested, but Clifford brutally killed this 14-year-old boy. He was then known simply Black-Faced Clifford. Only 2 weeks later, on the banks of the River Aire, a Yorkist sniper caught him cleanly in the throat, and he died on the banks of the River Aire. His wife, Mary, back in Skipton, was rather concerned due to her family's history, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the Yorkists came and took both her sons away. So therefore, she had her Netherlands, where he lived with the people of the Netherlands, and his other son was sent to live with the shepherds up in Cumbria, in Carlisle. Towards the end of the War of the Roses, of course, Lancashire got the upper hand, and she called for her 2 sons to come back. Sadly, Robin had died of scarlet fever in the Netherlands, but her other son, well, he was fine. Henry, he was brought back. One thing Henry could do was bring sheep into the world, but the one thing the lad couldn't do was read or write. So she had him sent to nearby Fountains Abbey, where he learned to read and write. And at the grand old age of 59, he led his troops into action against the Scots at the Battle of Flodden Field in 1513. But he was quite a character, really, quite a character.
Excellent, buddy. I think we're going to wrap it up there.
Very good, Scott. Very good. Thank you.
Would you just hold on to you for a couple of minutes, Simon, after we
Sure.
go off about it, right, buddy? But we'll certainly be having you back, because it's fascinating having you in. So before we go, folks, Sarah and I have a wee announcement to make for you. We were approached yesterday by Matthew Tomosic, who was Tomosic. Sorry, Matthew, you're still watching. Always a trouble pronouncing that name. Who's the assistant director on the film The Crumbs, and he works for CRA Entertainment. And he's asked us if we will branch out to America. So come beginning of next year, we're going to be having another team called Paranormal in History USA. Sarah and I will still be running everything. We'll still have the same YouTube channel, what have you. So that's coming in January. We're extending into America with a team from over there, headed up by Matthew. So we're really pleased about it. We're quite honoured that he came to us with the idea, and we're looking forward to working with them all. But we're back on tomorrow night at 8 o'clock with GSI. investigations. They're coming in just for a wee catch up. So thanks again to you, Simon, for coming in, and thanks
my pleasure
to everyone in the chat, and we shall see you all tomorrow night.
Yep.
So take care for now.
Bye.
Bye.
bye.